Nice, cool.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So on the docket today, we've got political divisions of the 1850s, essentially, that lead us up into and through the Civil War, which is felt up into and through and beyond the Civil War. Um, Within the context, perhaps, of Lincoln-Douglas debates, where we have Lincoln as our big loser there, essentially,
Right.
at least when the voting all come, when the votes are counted, he's the loser there. Arguably, that he wins the war later on with a presidential election 2 years later, and then yeah, I'll probably take us through the moment. But
Cool.
so I think something that's really important to start before we even get to Lincoln Douglas debates and kind of the context of them, it's really important to unpack the political divisions and the political factions of this moment, because we have this misconception that the Republican Party as it stands today is the Republican Party of Lincoln. That's how it's sold in the election. That's how it's sold in the 2020 election cycle. That's how it was sold from the GOP's perspective, and that the GOP is the party of Lincoln. And in a name, that's true. They are the Republicans. In name.
Sure.
But one of the kind of important distinctions is that 1858 is the kind of the stage for the Lincoln Douglas stuff, and Lincoln gets elected on the Republican platform in 1860, but they are not who they say they are, right?
Right.
So we have.
Well, let me go backwards to go forwards, I guess. So,
right.
Like, if we kind of rewind a little bit, I mean, there's a kind of an interesting like political party structure in the middle of the 19th century. You have the Jacksonian Democrats, which are like this common man, but what are they? They're the common aristocrat. Like they're not a commoner. They're a common landowning, plantation, slave owning white man. And so that kind of becomes like this new common place that the Democrats really, they start going around this traditional American lifestyle. They look back to the past. They're afraid of this huge, massive, like big businesses and big big confederation of states. Basically, they're really into like small family farms, almost kind of like that Jeffersonian ideals, but a little bit expanded upon, and more of those like independent states' rights and all of that. And they're really that whole political party that is stable throughout the Civil War era. But then after that, like, from the 1830s on, it's just who's going to oppose them. And it's just trying to find a party that will stick. I mean, you have the Whigs for a little bit, and they have a couple presidents, most notably my favorite presidency, just because of the hilarity of William Henry Harrison, who's president for like 32 days because he wants to prove how tough he is and give a speech in the cold, and he catches pneumonia and dies. Yeah. But then like you have the Free Soil Party, and you have kind of like this resurgence of the Whigs. But in reality, what becomes the main opposition that's successful is the Republican Party, that really is kind of a reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and this idea of popular sovereignty in the West.
Totally. And that ends up tracing up and through the rhetoric that you see Lincoln deploying, right? His main kind of enemy in engaging against Stephen Douglas for the senatorial race, right? We're not even talking presidency, right? It's talking smaller before we get bigger and stuff. And the idea of popular sovereignty comes through like really like heavy-handedly through that. And in 1858, he's reacting to the Kansas-Nebraska Act is in 54, but you have its like ultimate kind of the ultimate result, or the ultimate kind of connection of it to Dred Scott in 57 is like what he's running on and reacting to. He's reacting to a really weak Buchanan rebuke of Dred Scott. He's reacting to a really weak sense of decorum within all three branches of the government all at once. The fact that you have senators that are not being outspoken because they don't want to tank the Buchanan election cycle. You have a Supreme Court in 1856 that doesn't want to stir the waters and put out the verdict on Dred Scott because it'll tank the Buchanan election cycle. You have Buchanan who doesn't want to come out and say anything. And then election happens, Dred Scott Decision comes out, Buchanan speaks with the framers of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and says, hey, I understand how this is not a slave versus non-slavery thing. It's a states' rights issue. And him just like letting him off the hook there. And so like all these like interrelated things that's what comes to a head in the senatorial election cycle of Illinois in 58, where Lincoln stands up and he's opposing Douglas, who's a proponent, or at least a weak opponent to popular sovereignty. Who campaigns on like the allowance of that type of thing.
Right. And it's like, I think the biggest thing for me, for the Democrats at this time period, which obviously different than Democrats now, we'll get into that. But, the thing about Democrats then is, how do you make slavery palatable on a national level? And how can you make it to where we can kind of just switch the verbiage a little bit, or just enough to say, oh, it's a states' rights issue. Oh, you're not talking about, it's a different type of rights. You're either violating human rights or you're violating the states' rights. And if we're talking about the states' rights, it's easier to remove the slavery aspect from the discussion. And it makes it just a more palatable discussion, more digestible discussion nationally. Same thing as with the Constitution, right? There's a reason we don't have the word slavery in the Constitution, because they're like, well, that's not really our problem right now. And then it's a constant like pushing it off for somebody else to deal with. Kind of the same thing with Indian removal, right? Like Jackson is he's the one who signs off the bill of Indian removal, but every president before him had talked about wanting to push natives off of the land so they could essentially colonize. So it's just the political climate that he had was able to do it, much like
Totally. And then another thing that like comes to mind for me, at least when you're looking at that type of, it's the allowance, or like you said, hinging upon the idea that like you have a now much more, you have right to self-determination to an extent. The way that the Democrats run through the Kansas-Nebraska Act is it's the sacred right of self-government, right? And that it's that popular sovereignty is the sacred right of the person. And it goes back, this is going back to like, going back to the social contract idea, right? It's that like the individual sacrifices there's some freedoms so that they're able to enjoy the whole systematic kind of benefit. And one of those benefits is that you're gonna enjoy protections and freedoms. And let me tell you that in 1854, we're gonna say that also applies to your ability to move from one area to another and enact slavery, or opposition to slavery. That's been on the docket and been a point of contention since the constitutional conventions. That's why it takes so long to get your proto governments, is because you can't agree on those things. And then now we're here where we've said for approaching 100 years that we are going to we're going to get rid of that. We're waiting for the time to be right. And 100 years later, they're like, you know what? I think instead the country's getting bigger. We gotta make everyone happy. We gotta agriculture is working really well in the South right now. The whole fact that we're eliminating a worker wage population, that's really important, and so on and so forth. So you have it's done. It's presented, at least from the Democratic perspective in this time, as an almost like altruistic government intervention. Like they're altruistically allowing you to say, yeah, we're actually going to own people. We're going to continue to own people, and we're going to continue to spread out and own people over there, and we're going to own them over here, and so on and so forth. So
I think it's interesting too when you look at like talking about expansion, right? And the Democrats in the South really wanted this expansion quickly so they could get as many slave states as they could, and it was a way for them to quickly seize power. Because if you look at some of this stuff, they had to know that the writing had to be on the wall, right? Like, how feasible was it for the United States to continue slavery for the foreseeable future at that time? Yes, you have the Dred Scott Decision, but if you look globally, most other civilized, heavy air quotes on that one, most other civilized nations have already gotten rid of slavery by the time we go through the Civil War. Our domestic slave trade was the only slave trade we had as of like 1808. Yeah. So really, the slavery in the West is just because of us. Like it really kind of is. And it's interesting that the territorial expansion plays a part in that. And it's the way that each party kind of manages this manifest destiny westward expansion. You know, the Republican Party was in favor of like the Homestead Act, you know, where people could just go and claim any, you know, 160 acres or whatever it was that was surveyed by the government, regardless of who was there. As long as somebody hadn't claimed it yet, go for it.
It's funny because we were unpacking this a bit in class the other day, and it was like the notion of squatter sovereignty in that regard is that's how the Republicans, like, you know, they rehash what popular sovereignty means, and we were packing it in the name of Shameless and Frank's character from Shameless. I don't know if you've ever seen that TV show, but you know, Frank is just like the worst character you could imagine. And if you look at most of that series or that TV show, he's squatting in his like lovers' houses. He's squatting in, you know, neighbors' houses. He's squatting on properties, and it's overwhelmingly not a positively connotated word for this. Not for us now, not for us then, right? And so you have like this, you know, yeah, we want to settle the West, but when we kind of start to approach the question of something like slavery, you know, being involved into that whole experience, all of a sudden now we got all these things right. Oh, you know what? Not like we want to expand, but not like that. Like we want to expand in our way. And I think you're talking a little bit before this about how like economically that's definitely totally on par with what the Republican Party at this point wants to accomplish. They are obviously heavily centered in the North. They are obviously heavily centered around manufacturing, which is like, you know, or kind of industry that begs the question of whether or not you have wages that are involved. That runs the economy, that you have businesses that are, you know, developed all around it. There's restrictions that are starting to pop up. We don't have very strong, like incredibly strong unions, but we have some, right? It's like they're starting to get some steam, but to allow like then, you know, for new kind of westward, what could essentially be your westward neighbor, right? You could have a neighbor to already developed or states at this point that could prosper economically because now they don't have to pay wages, they don't have to pay workers, they don't have to abide by anything that's popping up, so on and so forth. So I really have this tension with the Republican Party and Lincoln also. Like I think Lincoln's he's a good guy, right? He kind of puts himself, you know, he puts himself in the fray a lot of times and stuff, but he's also intelligent enough to know that this isn't, yes, he brings in moral arguments, yes, that's part of it, but it's also incredibly economic. There's almost nothing that's done throughout the history of this nation that is not economically focused. We have this like kind of illusion of the United States as being like the longest lasting democracy or the longest modern democracy that is based around the simple like concept of, you know, human rights or the free ability to pursue happiness. But it's never been like that. And it does not work like that. It does not function like that. And I have a hard time believing the Republican Party runs on a platform that is as altruistic or morally upstanding as they would like you to believe. With, you know.
Yeah, and that's to expand on that a little bit, you know, Lincoln's considered a moderate. Like he's not this crazy progressive abolitionist that he's been painted over the years. And I think, you know, I talk about this in class, and I'm sure you've brought this up too, and we might have even brought this up together, but it's this like romanticized view of the past that we are presented with, right? And it's this idea that like, well, Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation and basically frees the slaves and keeps the Union together and defeats the Confederacy. So he had to be this great guy. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, he did a lot of great things, but he also was, you know, he wasn't necessarily he was okay with slavery existing where it was. He just didn't want it to expand. And that was the moderate platform at that time. It's like, well, obviously we can't allow slavery to continue, but, you know, where it is where it is. And it's like, I just, you know, it's kind of like, all right, I guess, is that sure. And to go back to your squatter sovereignty point, you know, that's what leads to Bleeding Kansas and John Brown, right? Like John Brown has this huge confrontation because people on both sides, abolitionists and pro-slavers, are trying to go and vote to sway this election or the vote on the state constitution, or what would be the state constitution, on whether or not slavery should be allowed. And so like you literally have violence over this, like pretty bad violence. And I think the more radical side of the abolition movement kind of comes from, I would say John Brown for me is like one of the leaders of the radical abolitionists. And you know, he's seen as a whole number of things, but Harper's Ferry's 1859, right? Like on the eve of the election and the Civil War. And so I can only imagine what kind of wrench John Brown throws into the presidential cycle, right? Like now what does Lincoln do? Does he have to condemn John Brown for doing something that he kind of actually supports? Or is he like, or does he embrace him and take the chance of losing this election? And I think he kind of has to toe the line there a little bit.
Totally. Yeah. And you kind of see, I mean, you look at John Brown's narrative too, and I talked about this like on that John Brown's like abolitionist kind of platform too is like so innately tied to like the morality or the national ethos around faith and Christianity. Like it bleeds so heavily into like even his like testimony at the very end, right? On the day that or on the days that he's going to be hung, his like last like little bit of kind of recourse and stuff, and it's just like this embodiment of like that, the evoking of that like moral obligation and stuff. And then you look the same to Lincoln, and that he's in a tough bind at that point, right? He's already said publicly that this is kind of the way that it goes, or that he is, that's who he's reaching out to. He's reaching out to his, brother and sister Christian across the aisle and stuff. And that's why A House Divided in 1858 is quoted straight from the Matthew chapter of the New Testament and stuff. It's Jesus' words, like he's not like quoting the Bible, but he's quoting the Bible that's quoting Jesus and stuff, and he's evoking that. And you see John Brown doing the same thing. He's like, you've got my back, dude, right? Like you understand this, right? And that's one of those ones where it's imaginably your eyes grow large, and when you're on the public stage at that point, that individual ethos, or even the collected shared ethos in that regard for the entire nation, kind of it gets tricky, because what are you willing to wager then for that? How much does it matter to you? And I think there's a lot of things that have led to you can back all the way up to the turn of the 19th century, and a lot of people right around 1790s, right, are talking about the exact thing. Like, wait a minute, you're Christian, but wait a minute, you also want to slaves? You want to enslave people?
Right.
So that doesn't disappear up into Lincoln, leading up into Lincoln. It doesn't disappear in the time between the Lincoln-Douglas debate and the election. It doesn't. That tension also like proceeds through the Civil War. Second inaugural address is all about that, right? He's talking about God's on both sides, but he picked one, right? He picked the right one. Oh, his words, the right one. So I don't know. There's so much.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting looking at Lincoln as a figure at that time and how people referred back to him, right? And I found this speech by Frederick Douglass on it's a oration in memory of Abraham Lincoln, and it's April 14th, 1876. And he talks about how wonderful it is, and we'll never forget the first day of January 1863, Emancipation Proclamation.
Sure.
Right? And he says, but he continues on, he says, nor shall I ever forget, he says, in that happy hour, we forgot all delay and forgot all tardiness, forgot that the president had bribed the rebels to lay down their arms by a promise to withhold the bolt which would smite the slave system with destruction. And it's that idea of like, hey, we're kind of going to slow walk this fight against slavery on the national level, just because we know that it's going to make things way worse. And really the fight for abolition as part of the Civil War isn't really the point at the beginning, right? Like the Union's completely okay with slavery existing as long as the Confederate States like fall back in line.
Right.
And it's like, and Douglas is kind of, I love Douglas, but to me, like sometimes he's just a rain cloud, right? Like this is the memory of Lincoln, and it's about like, I think it's 10 years or so after his death, like 10, 11 years. And he's like, yeah, great, fantastic. But don't forget, he dragged his feet trying to get us to freedom. And it's like, you know, don't forget, this is where we came from. And this is what the, you know, this is what the society was really like. And Lincoln was a moderate, like we were saying, and he loses the statewide race in Illinois, which speaks volumes to what Illinois was going through. And not just that, but how do you lose an election statewide in 58 and go on that same platform, if not more progressive, in 1860 and win nationally?
Totally.
I mean, it's pretty impressive.
Well, he alludes to it, right? He says he says in the opening of that in 58, and what historians like to point to as the speech perhaps that lost him the Illinois state senatorial race and then won him the election of 60.
Right.
And that he primes them for what he says, it goes either one of two ways. So you're either going to be an entire nation of slave owners, or you're going to be an entire nation of of people who believe in the evils of slavery and stuff. He's like, you don't get one or the other. He talks about there's no half of anything at the very beginning. So I foresee it. I foresee an event coming, a crisis on the horizon. I do not foresee a dissolution. I do, in fact, see the transition of us from one thing to another. And he actually presses on a little bit more. He says, you're either going to be a nation of free people or a nation of slave traders. He said, I think we tend towards the latter. In that moment, he says, I think we tend towards the latter. And I'm scared that we're working our way towards that stuff. And it's because he's frustrated. It's because he's upset. It's because he's looking at these things that are what, kind of complicates the whole issue. He looks at Dred Scott. He's looking at these things. That's problematic, of course. And I think what you said, that we can't imagine what's going on in Illinois at that point. It's like Illinois in and of itself, yes, anti-progression of slavery. Let's just leave it like that, right? Because they have people that are like Dred Scott went through Illinois with his master. He spends, they go to Wisconsin, but they travel through Illinois. And Lincoln has this moment where he's like, dude, here's the thing. Like, you pick that other guy, you pick popular sovereignty, you pick that platform, you pick the Democratic ticket and stuff. You keep going that direction. You're just going to be walking down the street, and it's going to be, he says it directly, you're going to walk down the street, and a master such as Dred Scott's master, not his own, with one slave or 1,000, will march down your streets and stuff. And that's him like looking at them. He's like, you idiots. Like, if you don't get this right, you're going to have, you're going to be walking down the street with your kids, and they're going to be like chains of slavery. They're going to be walking people around. It's going to make your neighborhood look bad, essentially. And then they're like, this guy's a lot. The other guy just wants other people to, when they get to new, like, unsettled places, to be able to do whatever they came there to do. But this guy is like, kind of not threatening us, but kind of, right? It's on the cusp. It's about to come. So
pretty close. He's pretty close to threatening. It's almost like that, like prophetic like speech, and John Brown is seen by some. I had this in some of my classes. Like, was John Brown a prophet? Where he claimed that, like, his last scribbled words before he was taken to the gallows basically said, like, this is going to end in bloodshed. And so they're like, did he see the Civil War coming, or was that kind of what everybody saw? I think we alluded to it earlier. I think everybody knew that the time was running out. Like, there's no way that this could continue. Just looking at the global events, by looking at kind of the domestic stuff, and even the division within the Democratic Party.
Right.
I mean, Douglas is, once the Civil War breaks out, it's kind of speaks even more to Illinois' status. Stephen A. Douglas is like, he's trying to maintain, this Union Democrat. He's not trying to secede. He's not trying to be a Confederate. He's like, no, we're in this Union. We're going to figure this out. Like, this is not so he's even that moderate Democrat, that middle Democrat. And I think that also explains why Lincoln probably lost in 58, is because Douglas wasn't that fire eater in the South, right? He wasn't the, like, screw the Union, we're out. He was kind of like, well, we need the Union for our posterity, and that was kind of his platform. So I think this is what I was telling you earlier. It's the Midwest is that, it's the moderate Midwest. You never really have crazy progressive movements coming out of the Midwest, other than maybe like the labor union. The union movements are kind of Midwestern, East Coast-ish, right? Like that whole steel Rust Belt. Yeah, exactly. But even that, that's not super progressive. And so you really don't, you have the talks of like Omar and Rashida Tlaib now, right? But those are few and far between in the Midwest.
Right. Yes, and then who decides our elections? It's where our elections are not decided by the incredibly progressive or incredibly conservative states. It's in those like moderate and swinging states, and that is the Midwest. That is the Rust Belt, with the exception of like the Kansases and the lower Midwest. But like your
Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin,
right,
Pennsylvania.
So like we look at it and we're like, oh man, like nothing really crazy comes out of those places. We like to toe the vanilla, right? But the consequences of that is that you now have an electorate that of those regions whose votes matter the most, especially in the vacancy of the labor unions. I know this is way removed from Lincoln and stuff, but like the reason why you can't count on, or you look at Ohio as a much more swing of a state than it might have been during the labor union kind of heyday, is that you don't have the labor union votes to count on anymore because those labor unions are gone. And so it's really interesting. It's funny to look back then and like look at like, okay, they're this close to one another and they're fighting like absolute hell to like talk about how devilish the other one is. Lincoln's just going to town
very similar
on Douglas and stuff, and but they're not that different. They're the ones that it was that smidge of information, that smidge of whatever pushed Douglas over and Lincoln under, and then alternatively in the election later on. So
sure. Just a weird side note, like on the Midwestern representation. When I was doing my research on representation, and it actually just finally clicked. I think there were 7 states in this when you look at senators that are close to like this sweet spot of one person, one vote, kind of like they actually meet that ideal threshold. And there's only like 7 states, and most of them are in the Midwest. So it's like it's interesting that these moderate Midwestern states that everybody flyover states, right? Like we're like we don't care about that, but they're probably the closest thing to what's actually happening nationwide. They have the best representation in terms of like, it's not underrepresented like California or overrepresented like Wyoming. They're moderately sized, right? Like, I mean, there's a few million people. There's not 40 million or 400,000. They're decent sized. They have a good amount of electoral votes. They still obviously have 2 senators, and they have a handful of representatives. So, I mean, we laugh at the Midwest here on the West Coast, and I'm sure the East Coast does too. But they might be the most accurate portrayal of where America actually is at that time.
Right, and that's kind of why they decide who leads us at the end of the day, right?
Right.
We can toss out. You can toss out your California. You can toss out typically most of the South. With the exception, like recently, of Florida, Georgia, and those kind of states, but the old reliables are going to be your Ohio's, your Michigan's, your Pennsylvania is a weird one too, right? I always think of Pennsylvania as like, if you think about it historically, it is the middle of the country at the very beginning, right? It's like the dead center middle, and it's got both, it's got gubernatorial emphasis, but also like you've got agriculture there, so it's like this mixture. It's the first Midwest, perhaps, of the United States.
And I think when we look at this region, right, you could almost say the Midwest maybe is more like the Great Lakes region, what we're talking about, right?
Totally.
And I think that it's such a unique brand of politics that I was discussing with my students about a week ago, I think, that West Virginia literally is created in 1863 because they basically tell Virginia, like, y'all are crazy for joining this Confederacy and like heading the Confederacy. Like, we're not on that. So we're gonna secede from you, who is seceding from the Union. And so you have this very, very independent, unique brand of politics in that Great Lakes region that I think people try and put an umbrella over, right? Like, but you just kind of can't. I mean, that's where in 16, Hillary doesn't go and campaign as heavily as she probably should have in the Midwest. And that blue wall crumbles and Trump's like, those are my people. And then in 2020, Biden sweeps them all back. And so it's like, there's no allegiance really to either party. It's that kind of like, who's going to do what's best for Michigan? Who's going to do what's best for Wisconsin?
Totally.
And I think it goes all the way back to here, right? Like the Lincoln Douglas debates. Who's going to do what's best for Illinois?
And for them that was Douglas. For them that was Douglas, right?
Right.
Dang. Well, I mean, like I said, they could talk about this over and over and over again. I think it's such a big moment that it's it's a big little moment, right? It's a big little moment in that, like, I was talking to my students about how, like, as an adult, even going into my like early adulthood, I heard Lincoln Douglas debates. And I thought, okay, Frederick Douglass is talking pretty heavily during this time. And I'm like, okay, did he debate Lincoln? Like, I remember always having that stuff. And it wasn't until much later, and I was like, before I came much more, I guess, interested perhaps in history and stuff. And I was like, what? We have this.
Hey, the Douglas with one S.
Totally different guy, but important. He loses then so that he can win later. And
I'm looking at the House Divided speech, and he talks about Senator Douglas's care not policy.
Yeah.
Right? And he outlines it. And I guess really, you could kind of summarize the Midwestern or Great Lakes or whatever we want to call it, that which would have been like the West in 1858. You can kind of summarize where they are with slavery at that point, because the first point, no slave imported from Africa or a descendant of slave from Africa could ever be a citizen of the United States.
Right.
Right. And so you're just like, okay, all right. Interesting point there. The second one,
he's looking at the kind of things that they allowed through the Dred Scott decision, and so he's like, he like calls them on that one thing. He's like, hey, you guys let this. You didn't care about this thing. And what it does is it means that no person from Africa is ever going to be a citizen of the United States. They're never going to be able to reap in the benefits of the Constitution. They're never going to, like, part of it's like, do you really mean this? Like, can you actually mean this? If he's talking at the Republican state convention in Illinois, he's talking to Republicans. He's talking about Illinoisans or people from Illinois, and he's looking right at them. He's like, we're the same thing, and how the heck can you think this way?
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is kind of to tie it into contemporary issues and contemporary politics a little bit, right? Like, we talk about party platforms and how they can kind of dictate where people are going, like their allegiance, right? Like where their allegiances fall politically. Mm-hmm. And by having this kind of splintered debate surrounding slavery for the Democratic Party, for sure, the Republican Party was a lot more cohesive in their beliefs. But you have the Democrats in the 1860s just completely faction off and fracture, and you're like, well, you have this Democrat, and then you have the Southern Democrats, and then you have the fire eaters and all these like crazy radicals. And I think we're starting to see that right now, like contemporarily with the current Republicans, right?
Sure.
And it's basically, we just had a Republican from Michigan, of all places, renounce his Republican, like his status of being a Republican. He's like, oh, I'm out. Like, this isn't the party that I signed up for, basically. Sure. And he's the second person to do this in the past year and a half or so. Justin Amash, another Michigander, was the first, right? So there's something in the water, maybe a bad timing joke if we're thinking about Flint, Michigan, but there's something in the water for sure with Michigan, and how Jeff Daniels from the Newsroom and Dumb and Dumber and all sorts of great movies.
Sure.
He's from Michigan and he's pretty politically involved. And he came and made a speech or made an appearance on some news show during like the last days of the election cycle. And it was just like, these are not the Republicans that my father was, who was a hardworking blue collar guy from the Midwest. This is not those regular, conservative ideas. This is something else.
Sure.
And so you're starting to see this division.
And then, I mean, not even just starting to see it. The same thing is true in the 2008 Tea Party. The same thing is true in the 2012 Tea Party, right? So like when you had, and I always look to the kind of Trump years, and I'm going to I think when I remember back to this, it's going to occupy the same brain space as the Tea Party for me. It's when there was like a staunch rejection by members of one party of the game that they had been playing for years, right? Like your old kind of old guard, old whatever Republicans, your even like your John McCain Republicans and stuff. They have this there's this air about them and stuff, and there's decorum with that. And there was and it went back to the Bushes, and it went back to beyond that, like to the Reagans and stuff. And like there's a sense of decorum that goes through that, through the Reagan years even, and then you get to the Obama presidency, and you start to see the rise of the Tea Party and this radical idea that no, we've got it all wrong this entire time. We've been fighting the wrong battle. Empower us, and we're going to change the world. And it's like they got empowered. The Tea Party wins out big, and it's just like everyone's like, what did we just do? The same thing happens in the Trump administration, and now we see the fallout from that. Like the Tea Party is like much less popular than it used to be, or at least within the last decade.
They've lost traction.
It's laughable, right? I look at the kind of the Jordan Klepper, the correspondent from the Daily Show, and his whole thing is like this guy gets on there and he's like, I'm part of the Tea Party, and he's like, you're part of what? That it's laughable. And then I think maybe the kind of factioning that we see within the Republican Party in the last presidency might kind of go the same way. You have your Trump Republicans and you have Republicans. They're different. And
and I think that like when you look at, and to come full circle, I guess, Project Lincoln, right? Like literally Project Lincoln, you have these guys who were responsible for that. Like it's like, and I had such a hard time wrapping my mind around being like, oh, Steve Schmidt, great, like, thank you. And it's like, dude, you brought us Sarah Palin. Like, you've created this like crazy brand of politics, and now that it's like come to its climax, you're like, oh my God, we got to stop this. It's like, thanks for fixing the mess that you created. See ya. Like, get out.
Right.
And like, take your money. You live on $1 million ranch somewhere. Like, go retire in silence, because I'm not going to give you this like, I'm not going to give you credit for fixing something you created.
Right. Well, and then you have to, that's what I'm talking about. It's like, you got to look back at that and be like, wait a minute, this is 2008 fighting 2020, and or now fighting itself later on and stuff. So, just, I felt the same way about a lot of that Lincoln stuff. There's like insane amounts of money that's being spent, and it's just like, again, you're putting out your own fire. And thank you for doing that, and I appreciate you. And you're a much more noble person for having done this instead of just leaving it. It's like camping, right? Take out what you bring in or whatever. So
right, like you were littered your campsite and then you cleaned it up when you left. Like, cool. Like, you cleaned up your mess and you left it the way it was before. Awesome.
Yeah.
Right, like, awesome. And I think it's interesting too, like looking at how these are reactionary. Right? Like, I mean, in all honesty, the Tea Party is a reaction to this progressive movement that comes along with Obama. Right? It's, I mean, I think they took the House in 10, right? Mm-hmm. So like they start the stuff in 08, 9, and then they really take over in 2010. And then you have the blue wave in 2018, which is just like a gut punch reaction by the left of Trump's presidencies. And so I think this is what I talk about in my class all the time. It's, if we want to talk about where American politics lie, we're largely in the middle. We'll have a large swing left for maybe 4 or 8 years, and then we'll slowly come back to the middle, and then we'll swing to the right for 4 or 8 years, and then we'll come back. It's like a clock, it's a pendulum.
Yeah.
And you can't really, it never stops in one place. It might stop for like a brief second, and then it's to the left or to the right. You never really know kind of where it's going to go. But I think it's going to be interesting to see, talking about our last time we talked, the House, Democrats lost seats in the House.
Right.
So where do we go from here? It's going to be interesting.
I mean, we got about a month to find out where the Senate lies. So we got an interesting amount of time ahead of us to see how.
Well, and that they said they're estimating $500 million in campaign spending. I mean,
all the money that was in the election now is being diverted into a Georgia runoff now. Everyone's doing it. And I mean, no better person to organize the Georgia kind of Democratic ideals than Stacey Abrams and stuff. And so if it's gonna cost $500 million, okay, we spent $500 million on stuff that doesn't matter. So if it's gonna be something that matters, I'm willing to kind of But then
it's not government spending.
Right. It's people. It's people finally finally putting their money where it's supposed that's important to them. We get to that whole slippery slope of California electing Georgia though, if we send a ton. So I don't know.
Or just influencing it, not even having. That's that whole Jamie Harris and Lindsey Graham paradox, or whatever you want to call it, right? He loses by double digits, but he has record fundraising. It doesn't make sense. But and we could talk about this on another day. But the idea that the Republican Party is basically telling Georgians don't trust democracy right now. With the Senate decided, the Senate is hanging in the balance. And if the Republicans can campaign and hold on to 2 seats that they already have, they have control of the Senate. And they're like, you can't trust Georgia. Don't trust the governor. Don't trust the Secretary of State. Don't trust the election machines. Don't trust any of it. And the Democrats are like, oh, all right, don't. Go for it, I guess.
Don't come vote. We'll go vote for you. It's all good. I mean, we've had a landslide of Trump defeats in terms of challenging election results. There's not been one that has been upheld. The Supreme Court yesterday or 2 days ago was like, okay, it's over, and it's over. The Electoral College, they've casted the votes, it's over. So it's really an interesting kind of spot, but we'll see how it plays out. I think about in a month's time we'll be having either a glorious conversation about the nationwide blueprint, or we'll be kind of hanging our heads and saying, okay, well, we'll see what it's like.
Bad 3 ain't bad.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that whole idea of the Lincoln and the House divided speech is very relevant to today's politics, just because people always compare right now to the Civil War. We've never been this polarized since the Civil War. And it's true. I mean, I think you could really read Lincoln's speech, certain parts of it, obviously not the slavery parts, and it would pretty much apply.
Totally.
You're either going to have a political party that's going to look out for the rights of an individual, or you're not. And I think the Republican Party today is interesting in the sense that they act like they're the party for the commoner, right? They act like they're the common man's party, but they give tax breaks to the ultra wealthy,
to the billionaires.
Yeah, they're not raising taxes to provide social help, or even listening to legislation on the Senate floor. So it's this whole marketing thing, right? And we also talked about maybe it's just the singular issue of the Supreme Court. That's all that matters. You never know.
Right. Well, it's that, and then the bootstraps that everyone's supposed to be pulling themselves up by. That
the government bootstraps, yeah.
Yeah, the bootstraps. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end it for today. Again, there's a million other things that we got time, so we'll bring a couple more things into the fray. Today is Lincoln Douglas. Tomorrow we'll tune in to something else. All right.
Sounds good.
All right.